The kitchen clock ticked louder each time she passed it. At first, she told herself it was just fatigue, the way her ears strained after long evenings at the office, the way shadows deepened in the corners of the apartment. But the first night it happened, the sound had been so unnerving she froze mid-step, the wooden floor cold beneath her bare feet. She swore she could feel the ticking vibrating through her bones, echoing not just in the room but inside her chest, marking her heartbeat against its own. It was a round clock, plain as any other. A brushed silver rim, white face, black numerals. But the second hand moved with a precision that seemed almost deliberate, almost sentient. When she entered the kitchen from the hall, it would pause ever so slightly, then resume with a sharp, almost accusatory tick, as if aware of her presence. She began to notice that it wasn't just the volume that changed. The rhythm itself seemed to adjust to her steps. When she walked briskly, the ticking followed, quickening to match. When she lingered by the counter, it slowed to a deliberate, resonant drag. The sensation left her unmoored, as if her own sense of time was being measured, weighed, monitored. The first week, she tried ignoring it. She convinced herself it was the low hum of fatigue, the resonance of an old building settling, the acoustic anomaly of linoleum and walls. Yet, each evening the clock grew bolder. Sometimes she'd step into the kitchen to pour a glass of water, and the tick would precede her movement, anticipating her approach. The second hand jerked slightly to the left, then right, not unlike a bird flinching at an unseen threat. She thought she might be imagining it, until she caught herself in the reflection of the window. The second hand was moving backward for a brief, impossible instant. She blinked, and it corrected itself, the hands resuming their march forward, as if nothing had happened. Sleep became shallow and fractured. She'd wake in the middle of the night, hearing the clock from her bedroom, which was several rooms away. There was no mistaking the sound. It was closer than it should be, precise and invasive. She began keeping notes in a small notebook, attempting to track the clock's behavior. Ticks that aligned with her thoughts, pauses that mirrored her hesitations, erratic accelerations that coincided with decisions she had yet to act on. She noticed, horrified, that the clock seemed to know when she was about to open the door to leave for work, when she lingered in indecision, when she considered calling her mother. It was no longer just a timekeeper, it was an observer. One evening, she poured herself a cup of tea and leaned against the counter, trying to calm the panic gnawing at her ribs. The kitchen was warm, the faint smell of burnt toast lingering, but the ticking was insistent, impossibly loud. She placed her hand over her eyes, willing herself to breathe through it. She tried to measure the seconds in her head, counting silently, but the clock did not agree with her. She stopped at 10, and the clock had already passed 20. When she dared to look again, the hands had skipped, landing somewhere off the grid of normal time. By the second week, anomalies had begun to invade her memory. She would enter the kitchen and swear she had already been there, that she had already poured tea and left the mug half full on the counter. Notes she hadn't written appeared in her notebook, lines of cursive she did not recognize. Photographs from her apartment, once familiar, now seemed subtly altered. In one, she saw herself standing in the kitchen, eyes wide with terror, the clock's second hand blurred as if moving too fast to capture. But she remembered no such photograph being taken. She began to notice subtle manipulations in her perception of time. If she lingered in the kitchen, the room would stretch around her, the ceiling seeming higher, the walls further apart. A second of hesitation could become a minute, an hour, and yet the clock's hands barely moved, maintaining a mockery of continuity. At times, when she was brushing her teeth or washing dishes, she'd glance at it and see the hands in reverse motion, dragging time back to moments she could not recall making. Each time, the ticking seemed to mock her. Faster, slower, sharp, accusatory, responding to her every motion, her every thought. Once, on a particularly harried morning, she swore she heard a whisper threaded into the tick itself, syllables almost intelligible. A warning? An accusation? She could not tell. The sound seemed to stretch from the second hand itself, the metal spine of the clock vibrating with a secret language. She pressed her ear closer, and the tick accelerated, trembling against her eardrum. She felt her pulse synchronize with it, involuntarily. When she pulled away, her wristwatch read 15 minutes behind. The world outside remained unchanged. The clock had moved her, bent her perception, and the city outside had no idea. Her friends began to notice her absences, the increasing hesitation in her voice. She avoided invitations, rationalized being busy, but inside, the apartment had become a labyrinth. Every room intersected with the tick. Sometimes, she could hear it from the bathroom while brushing her hair, its rhythm coaxing a memory she could not name, a sense of shame or guilt that seemed personal, intimate. The clock was no longer just marking time. It was surveying it, recording her, anticipating her. Late one night, she attempted a confrontation. She stood in the kitchen, illuminated by the dim orange glow of the stove light. Her hand hovered over the clock, trembling. "What do you want?" she whispered. The tick stopped abruptly, so complete it left a ringing silence in her skull. She exhaled, heart hammering. Then it resumed slowly, deliberately, counting down instead of up. She backed away. It was predicting her retreat, responding to fear rather than proximity. She tried reasoning with herself. It's a mechanism, an optical illusion, a trick of sound. But the second hand twitched in perfect mimicry of her pulse, jerking forward in tandem with her panicked thoughts. Days blurred. She could no longer track reality. At times, she felt herself living multiple sequences simultaneously, pouring tea twice, opening doors twice, hearing conversations twice. The clock ticked omnipresently, a constant litany of seconds that were hers and not hers. Her reflection in the window one evening made her flinch. She saw herself freeze mid-step, staring at the clock, while the clock ticked with an almost smug precision, measuring a hesitation she had not consciously taken. She realized with horror that the clock could reach inside her mind, anticipate her indecision, replay her regrets as mechanical certainties. And then the time slips began. She would glance at the hands, and whole minutes would vanish. Food left on the stove would appear cooked or cold, sometimes in reverse, as if the day itself had been rewritten. She saw the newspaper on the counter with a date she did not recognize, yesterday folded into tomorrow. Sometimes the ticking seemed to count toward something beyond hours, something she could not comprehend, a tally of events, choices, or sins. She stopped leaving the kitchen. She stayed near the counter, near the clock, trying to learn its pattern, trying to survive the rhythm. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound, the linoleum waves beneath her feet trembling in harmony. She whispered apologies to it, confessions, questions that went unanswered. When she slept, she dreamed in ticks, a metronome of memories, some hers, some fabricated, all under the surveillance of the second hand. On the final evening she could recall with certainty. She stood in the center of the kitchen, the apartment silent except for the clock. She felt it watching her. The tick had slowed, deliberate, patient. It stretched the moment taut as a wire. Her reflection in the window showed her hands hovering in midair, frozen in the act of reaching for the knob of the refrigerator. Then the tick leapt forward, not by seconds but by minutes. She blinked, and the kettle had boiled, water spilling silently, but her notebook lay open with a new entry. "You are exactly where you should be." The words were in her handwriting, yet she knew she had not written them. The tick pulsed. It waited. She backed into the hallway, heart hammering. Every step counted, measured, recorded. Each time she passed the clock, the ticking followed, faster now, predicting her next move with unnerving precision. She pressed her ear to it one last time. A whisper, low and intimate, carried inside the tick. "And yet, you never leave." The apartment grew colder, the shadows long and dense. Outside, the city continued its indifferent rhythm. Inside, the clock ticked on, louder than ever, anticipating each breath, each thought, each hesitation. And she understood with a hollow certainty that time itself had stopped being hers. The second hand quivered, poised at 12, then 13, then she could not count anymore. And somewhere, deep inside, she felt the faint, inevitable pull of a schedule she would never escape, orchestrated by a mechanism that lived only to observe. The kitchen clock ticked louder each time she passed it, and she passed it again. Her reflection in the oven door was smiling. It was subtle at first, a twitch at the corner of her mouth, a lift of the cheek she hadn't intended. She paused mid-step, the spatula clutched in her hand, and stared. The kitchen was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the low hiss of the gas burner. The light above the stove cast a pallid glow, bouncing off the stainless steel surfaces, painting the room in sharp reflections. Yet the reflection did not look like her. Not quite. Her eyes were narrower, the tilt of her head just slightly off. And that smile lingered, slow, deliberate, entirely absent from her own face. She blinked, half expecting it to vanish, but the smile stayed. She leaned closer, pressing her palm against the cool metallic surface, and the reflection mimicked the gesture, then exaggerated it, stretching her fingers impossibly long. Her own pulse spiked. She stepped back. The reflection remained in place, watching, grinning. That night, she avoided the kitchen. Every time she thought about cooking or even walking past the oven, she felt the weight of eyes on her. But the reflection had a habit of appearing when she wasn't in front of the glass at all. She would enter the living room and see the faint glint of a smile reflected on the oven door from the hallway light. Sometimes, when she passed the doorway, she could swear it winked. Sleep became impossible. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing faint metallic clicks and the hiss of distant appliances. In her dreams, the kitchen elongated unnaturally. Counters stretched into impossible angles. The refrigerator leaned toward her like a predatory shape. And in each vision, the reflection waited, smiling. When she woke, she would check the oven door. Never her own movements, always the reflection's choice. The anomalies escalated slowly, subtle but unnerving. One evening, she set a mug of tea on the counter. The reflection tilted its head, watching, then sipped from the mug without hesitation. The liquid seemed to remain still in reality, the mug untouched. She recoiled, her palms sweaty. The reflection returned to her original height, smiling, unbothered by her horror. By the second week, the reflection began to anticipate her actions. She would reach for a knife, and the reflection would lift its hand first, waiting, then mimic her movements with uncanny precision, or sometimes deliberately delay them, observing her hesitation. Sometimes, it would smile when she frowned, frown when she smiled, or tilt its head in mockery. It did not always mimic. Sometimes it acted independently, as though it had its own intentions. She began documenting it, writing down every detail. The subtle widening of the smile, the pauses before it returned her gestures, the way it appeared in corners of the glass even when she stood to the side. Notes filled with phrases like delayed reaction and independent gestures sprawled across her notebook, pages curling at the edges from nights spent clutching the cold metal. The kitchen felt different, hostile. Light bounced oddly off surfaces, elongated shadows that didn't match the angles of furniture, and the floor seemed to warp beneath her feet. One morning, she noticed something impossible. She hadn't approached the oven, but the smile was there in the reflection, watching from the far side of the room, eyes trained on her as she poured cereal. It was impossible, her reflection could not be visible from that angle. She froze, spoon suspended midair. The reflection's grin widened, sharp and knowing, teeth too white, too perfect. She swallowed hard, trying to rationalize. Light reflection, distorted angle, optical illusion. Yet every fiber of her body screamed that it was conscious, aware. She began to dread her own movements. She stopped looking directly at the oven, eating in the living room, even avoiding the hallway that led past the kitchen. But the reflection found ways to reach her. Faint glimmers in the microwave door, on the toaster's polished surface, in the fridge handle, each reflection warped, smiling, independent. Sometimes, she would catch a fleeting image in the window behind her, a backward glance that made her heart stall. And each time, the smile lingered, patient, omnipresent. Her isolation grew. Friends called, but she avoided them, finding excuses. She began muttering to herself, attempting to assert control, asking the reflection questions it never answered. She gestured, waved, shouted. The reflection responded selectively, sometimes imitating, sometimes ignoring, sometimes mocking. She stopped moving in the kitchen, standing frozen like a statue when she had to pass, her shadow trembling against the wall. One night, she dreamed the oven door swung open. Inside, there was a corridor she didn't recognize, walls glinting metal, faint echoes of laughter bouncing off the surfaces. She walked in, drawn to the soft, deliberate rhythm of the smile. When she reached the end, she saw herself, her exact self, standing still, smiling with the same exaggerated grin. She blinked, and the figure moved forward, reaching toward her chest. She woke screaming, lungs burning, only to hear a soft metallic chuckle from the kitchen. The next morning, she found the oven door slightly ajar. She hadn't touched it. The kitchen was empty except for her reflection, standing perfectly still, smiling, waiting. She pressed her hand against the glass. The reflection pressed back, but its smile did not falter. It seemed to breathe, to live while she felt hollow. Days passed, but the reflection did not waver. She began to notice small differences she couldn't explain. Objects in the kitchen subtly shifted, shadows bent impossibly, metallic surfaces gleamed where no light fell. She noticed her own hands trembling, her reflection never mirroring them exactly, sometimes smirking at her mistakes, sometimes preempting them. Every glance into polished metal was a game of anticipation, every shadow a threat, every smile a promise of observation. She stopped cooking altogether. The fridge contained untouched groceries, the stove gathered dust. She began eating cold food, microwaving cereal, avoiding the kitchen's full light. Yet every surface betrayed her. One evening, she reached for a cabinet knob and glimpsed it in the toaster's reflection. It raised a finger, pointed at her, then leaned back, tilting its head as if marking her fear. The last night she could remember clearly, she stood in the doorway of the kitchen, the room bathed in the dim halo of the overhead light. She watched the oven door. The reflection was already smiling, a slow, deliberate curl of lips that made her stomach coil. She took a tentative step forward. The reflection raised both hands now, waving gently. Then it leaned closer, tilting its head, eyes glinting in the harsh metallic sheen. She realized with icy certainty that it was not waiting for her to act. It had been waiting for her entire life. She blinked, and the oven door showed not just the reflection, but her entire self, standing behind her in the hallway, smiling impossibly still, smiling always. The metallic surface rippled faintly, like water disturbed by a stone. She reached out, wanting to close the distance, to reclaim herself, but her hand met only cold steel. Her reflection moved on its own, pressing a finger to its lips, then pointing toward the darkened hallway behind her. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream, but her body felt heavy, unresponsive, as though the reflection's smile had seeped into her bones, rooting her to the floor. She could hear faint whispers, her own voice, perhaps, calling her name, urging her forward, laughing softly, cruelly. When the light flickered, she was gone. The oven door remained, stainless steel dull under the dim kitchen light, and in its surface, a smile lingered, patient, slow, eternal, waiting. Her reflection in the oven door was smiling, and it was still smiling,